Welcome to the 18th video on ancient Rome. In this video, we are going to be covering the third and final Samnite War, and that lasted from 298 to 290 BC. Now, in the last video, of course, we covered the second Samnite War, which ended in 304 BC. And then there was this interwar period between 304 and 298 BC. Now, I hesitate to call that a time of peace because Rome was involved with a series of clashes that broke out with the Etruscans in 302 BC, and in 299 BC, Rome fought the Umbrians. And so by the time that Rome and the Samnites started fighting again in 298 BC, Rome was already engaged in some battles up north. And so this is a problem because there's fighting on all fronts, and that was something that Rome was trying to avoid. And this was really an attempt by many of the provinces around Italy to make one final stand against Rome. And the main reason was fear. Fear of Rome becoming too powerful. And so again, Rome would have to fight on multiple fronts. And so the major alliance would be between the Samnites, the Umbrians, the Etruscans, the Gauls, the Sabines, and numerous other tribes. And so again, this was the very thing that Rome had desperately been trying to avoid from the beginning. They wanted to take on all these guys individually and not have to fight against all of them in a major alliance. Now, it was bad enough that the Romans had to take on the Samnites again, but now they had to take on the Gauls as well? Now, the Samnites would be the de facto leader here, and they actually recruited many of their neighbors to this massive alliance. And so Rome was in mortal danger. This was really an alliance that threatened to sweep Rome right off the map. And so they turned to some of their most experienced commanders. Now, in the first year of the war, in 298 BC, the consulship was awarded to Cornelius Scipio and Fauvist Maximus. Now, Cornelius Scipio came from the house of Scipio, and future generations of Scipios will be involved in several Roman wars. And so they were a titanic house in ancient Rome. Now, since the Romans were fighting on multiple fronts, the two consuls decided to head in different directions. Scipio launched an attack against the Etruscan countryside. Now, the main Etruscan army refused to meet Scipio in the open field, and so Scipio laid siege to several cities and ravaged the entire countryside. And so this caused some serious disarray within Etruscan territory. Now, Fauvist attacked deep into Samnite territory and scored a major victory at Bovianum, which you can see right here on the map, and you can see how deep that is within Samnium territory. And so the Romans had the initiative in the first year of the war. In the next year, in 297 BC, Fabius Maximus and Publius Decius were elected consuls. Now, it was Fabius Maximus who had knocked out the Etruscans in the second Samnite War. So he's back again. And Fabius and Decius were good buddies. They had been elected consuls in 308 BC, so they had a good relationship and worked well with each other. And so Fabius demanded that Decius also be elected consul in that year, 297 BC. Now, both men would lead their legions down to the south, and near to Furnum, the Romans achieved a victory. But the Samnites were allowed to escape and headed north over the next year to link up with their latest allies, the Gauls, the Umbrians, and the Etruscans. And so essentially Samnium was left unprotected because the Samnite army again headed north. And that allowed Decius to ravage the Samnium countryside. But nonetheless, the Romans were very concerned about the Samnites heading north and linking up with all of their new friends. And the combined allied force reached around 80,000. Now, that was one of the largest armies ever seen up to that point on the Italian peninsula. And so the Romans really were not interested in taking on an army that size. Now, Hannibal and Caesar certainly didn't have a problem taking on armies that size. Sometimes they were outnumbered 2 and even 3 to 1. But again, that was Hannibal and Caesar. But Fabius decided wisely here to try to get that army split up. And what the Romans did here was they launched diversionary attacks against Etruscan and Umbrian territory. And the tactic worked. The Etruscans headed home to defend their territory. And so almost overnight, the Samnite allied army was now around 50,000. And that was a much more manageable number for the Romans. And so that brought about the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC. Now, you will notice that Fabius and Decius are consuls yet again in 295. Now, of course, they were elected just 2 years earlier in 297. Now, if you were elected consul, as we have talked about, you were only allowed to serve that term for 1 year. and then you couldn't serve again for a period of 10 years. But the Romans decided to throw that rule out in this case because they faced mortal danger, and they wanted their two best commanders running the army, and so that is why Fabius and Decius were re-elected as consuls. So if you take a look at this, Fabius is on the right with his 2 legions, and Decius is on the left with his 2 legions. And on the left side are the Samnites and the Gauls. The Samnites would be on the left side of their formation, and the Gauls on the right side of their formation. So Fabius would be squaring off with the Samnites, and Decius would be squaring off against the Gauls. Now, as you can see, the Romans kept some reserves up there in the top right-hand corner, and those were called auxiliaries. Both sides had cavalry protecting the flanks of their armies. And the Romans at this battle were using an elite squadron of companion horse units. And the reason for this was the Romans were not experts at cavalry. And so the companions, who were the latest allies of Rome, of course, would play a huge role in this battle. Now, if you take a look at the Gallic formation, you'll see those chariots that they're hiding behind their lines back there. Now, there's been some debate how the Gauls got chariots, and one of the theories that's been floated around is that the Etruscans gave the chariots to the Gauls or left them behind, and the Gauls were able to use those. But remember those chariots, because I'll be talking about those in a few minutes. Now, one thing to note here is you can see the Romans, of course, are using the maniple. So you see each one of those little rectangles there, that represents a maniple. Now, you'll notice that the Samnites are using that as well. And as I mentioned before, the Romans probably borrowed the maniple from the Samnites. And the Gauls would just launch a mass attack. As you can see there, they are not divided into maniples. It's just one gigantic mass. And that is the tactic that they use. Now, for 2 days, both armies refused to offer battle. And they just sort of sat around and stared at each other. What are they doing? Well, maybe this is like a boxing match where both sides are staring and glaring at each other, with each side trying to get a psychological advantage. Who knows? But eventually the Romans decided to take the initiative and launch their attack against both the Samnite and Gallic formations. And of course the Romans always liked to attack first. It reminds me of what Frederick the Great said. Prussians always go on the attack. And so both sides were now fighting in close quarters. And you have to think that each side knew that this would be a war-winning battle. Now, at this critical juncture, the Gauls decided to launch their secret weapon, and they tossed their chariots into the fray, and those chariots crashed into the Roman lines, causing serious disarray. And so after having their left flank shattered by the Gallic chariots, the Roman soldiers on that side began to flee the battlefield. Now, Decius tried desperately to restore order, but could not. And so Decius launched his own suicidal attack into the Gallic lines and died in the process. Now, after his death, this heroic act served its purpose and it stopped the Roman retreat. But still, they were under heavy assault from the Gallic right flank. Now, Fabius on the right side was actually doing better. His legions were actually gaining the upper hand against the Samnites. Now, one thing I admire about Fabius here is that he didn't panic with the unfortunate news that the 2 legions on the left were in dire straits. And so he kept a clear head and made sound battlefield decisions. And so what he did here was deploy half of the reserves to Decius's battered army and shored up the left flank of that side. And so with the situation restored on the left side, Fabius decided to win his own battle against the Samnites on the right side. And so he deployed the rest of the reserves against the Samnites. And he also sent some of the companion horse on his own flank to attack the Gauls from the rear. Now, after some ferocious fighting, the Samnites eventually lost heart and fled the battlefield with the Roman legions in hot pursuit. Fabius then was able to redeploy some of his forces against the Gallic rear, and shortly after that, the Gauls too lost heart and fled the battlefield. And while they were fleeing in terror, the Romans cut down many Gallic and Samnite warriors, because an army in retreat is always at its most vulnerable. And so Fabius won the day, and the Romans had a major victory. A victory on a battlefield at this point was the largest battle in terms of numbers ever fought on the Italian peninsula. The final numbers were indeed staggering. 25,000 Samnites and Gauls were killed, just 8,000 Romans died at the battle. And the Samnites after this would never be the same. Although there would be a few more battles fought, their time as an independent state was essentially over, and after the Third Samnite War, they would essentially be under Roman control. There would be a brief rise in the Pyrrhic Wars, which we're going to get to in the next video, but for all intents and purposes, the Samnite independence was over. Now, the Romans actually offered pretty generous terms, which the Samnites accepted in order to get out of the war. Okay, so let's take a look at the Roman territorial gains after the Samnite Wars. Rome's territory now exceeded extended all the way to the Po River up north, and you can see that on the bottom map here. Now, above the Po River were the Gauls. Now, the policy of the Romans over the next several centuries would be to contain the Gauls, because Rome was now looking to the rest of southern Italy. Now, if we take a look at that map on the top, those are the Greek colonies in southern Italy. And Rome pretty much controlled all of the territory in the south except for the Greek colonies. They refused to submit. And what a shock, right? Greek colonies refused to submit. The Greeks didn't submit to anybody. And some of those cities were Tarentum, you can see that right here. Thurii, you can see that right here, and the rest of the Greek cities, and we'll get into those in the next video. Now, Carthage and Greece, the other two powers on the Mediterranean, were beginning to take notice of Rome. Now, Rome's population growth was absolutely staggering. There were 150,000 people living in Rome, so it was one of the largest cities on the Mediterranean, and that was because people wanted to be a part of this increasingly successful city. Now, if you factor all of the citizens around the other provinces in Italy, the total approached around 1 million citizens, and if you factor in Rome's allies, it was even larger. So Rome had one of the largest populations on the Mediterranean. Now, in the next video, we will focus on Pyrrhus and the Greeks, and that means the Greek phalanx and the Roman legion will go head to head. So I will see you guys then.